here in a second. All right. So we're happy today to have Lynn talking about knowledge spillovers and firm exports, evidence from China. House rules are, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask like you would in a normal seminar. Then we'll have time for more comments and questions at the end. Lynn, go ahead. You have 60 minutes.
Great. Good morning. I keep saying good morning because it's 4 a.m. here. Afternoon, evening, everyone. Many thanks to Kim and the other organizers for the kind invitation to present. I'm Lynn Tian from INSEAD, and this is joint work with Yue Yu from University of Toronto, who is also in the audience today, and she will be available to answer any questions that you may have during the talk using the chat function. So in this paper, we study knowledge spillovers in the export market. This is still a very much work in progress, so any comments, feedback, suggestions are greatly appreciated. All right, so let's get started. Sorry. Okay. For the past couple of decades, two major trends emerge, right? The first one is the rising globalization, right? For example, this huge increase in the volume of international trade. And the second one is the rapid changes to domestic economic geography, or which just simply means the spatial distribution of economic activities within countries. And there has been a long-lasting interest in understanding the interactions between these two major trends. A large literature has been dedicated to establishing the role that trade plays in creating this uneven distribution of the economic consequences across different locations within a country, right? And therefore, looking at how trade reshapes the spatial distribution of economic activities domestically. Many papers on that. I'm just listing a few of the more prominent examples here. In contrast, much less is less understood on the opposite relationship. All right, that is to say, we still don't have a very good idea about whether and how the domestic spatial distribution of economic activities can affect a country's trade performance. In particular, there's wide belief that having export clusters can benefit individual exporting companies. Right. In fact, this very belief has already justified many government programs and policies that subsidize and create export clusters. For example, in mainland China, Taiwan, India, Thailand, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea here is pretty simple, right? The belief is that there are knowledge spillovers that exist among exporting firms. Right. For example, the presence of other exporting firms can help reduce the informal trade barriers for other firms that are nearby. So by observing my neighbors, I can acquire tacit knowledge about foreign markets that are crucial to my own export performance, right? So such tacit knowledge includes information about price distribution in the international market, information about the foreign consumer preferences and tastes, how do I find a trusted foreign distributor, and so on and so forth. All this tacit knowledge could be transferred between exporting firms that are located close to each other, and which generates this knowledge spillovers in the export market. All the idea sounds very intuitive and hopefully credible to you. There has been limited literature, especially empirical studies, that establish the effect of export clusters on firms' trade performance. And one of the key reasons is because this is something that is very challenging to identify empirically. Why? Because location is endogenous, right? Therefore, it's hard for us to separate geographic concentrations arising from this knowledge spillover, which is what we want to identify, from other site-specific confounders, right? These are other factors that attract firms to locate in a specific location, and hence giving rise to geographic concentration, but at the same time also affects firms' export performances. Lynn. So in this paper, yep.
Hi.
Hi.
So you seem to be focusing here on the knowledge spillovers as the source of why firms want to cluster. But if I think of Marshallian externalities in general, there were labor market concentrations in specialized input providers. So there seems to be two challenges. Not only is geography endogenous, but also what's a source of externality that's leading firms to cluster? Are you going to talk about both or just the first?
Yeah, if I understand your question, I guess you are thinking, right, even if we can identify there's this spillover, this externality, is this something that is specific to export? Or this is just plain old agglomeration forces?
No, my question is more of, is it knowledge or is it other sources of externality? Does it need to be knowledge?
It doesn't need to be knowledge spillovers, although we find some evidence that shows that this exchange of knowledge is likely to be one important source. So here we're just saying that we're trying to establish that firms can benefit. So what we mean by knowledge spillover is really firms can benefit by being close to other exporting firms.
Okay.
And that's something that we want to study and understand better in this project. But thanks very much for that important clarifying question. All right, so that's the identification challenge. And in this paper, we are going to tackle this identification challenge by leveraging a unique empirical setting. Specifically, we are going to use the development of a major infrastructure project, which is the high-speed rail project in China, as a quasi-experiment. The expansion of this HSR significantly reduced the commuting time for passenger travels between cities, right? For example, before HSR, it would take more than 13 hours for people to travel between Beijing and Shanghai, the two largest cities in China. And now it only takes less than 5 hours. So what that means for the purpose of our study is that exporting firms in Beijing and Shanghai now become effectively closer to each other, right? Making the interactions for firms that are located in these two cities easier and more efficient. So therefore, the expansion of this HSR network is going to promote the geographic integration by reducing effective distance and thereby facilitating this effective knowledge diffusion and idea exchanges through more frequent face-to-face interactions. So let me give you a real-life example about how an export firm can learn about foreign markets because of the HSR. And this comes from an article in New York Times back in 2013. So the story is about Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee is a sales manager of a textile company that exports to foreign market. And his company is located in Changsha, which is a city located in the southwestern part of China. He used to travel to Guangzhou twice a year, and Guangzhou is about 700 kilometers away from Changsha, and is of course the commercial and export hub of textile industry. With the opening of HSR station in Changsha and Guangzhou, he now goes every month on this very punctual bullet trains. And he said that these business trips allow him to stay updated about the market environment and the foreign consumer preferences, such as their fashion changes and fashion changes in colors and styles. And as a result, his orders have increased by 50%. Of course, this is just one anecdote, one story. But in this project, we are going to formalize this process and carry out a formal empirical test to test whether being effectively.
Just a quick question. I mean, that description or that anecdotal evidence, it just sounds like the costs of trade have fallen. So I didn't sort of see like where the externality was in that description. I mean, it's just the guy can go back and forth more often. So yeah, can you help me focus a little bit more on how that's a good example of the externality or the knowledge spillover?
Right. So we are saying that the costs have fallen. The export specific costs have fallen because now it's easier for him to travel to Guangzhou, where there's a huge cluster of other exporters, for him to acquire information that are specific to the export market. So this helps him to reduce export specific costs. For the purpose of our study, is just the reverse of the export specific productivity.
Okay.
And we are, making a statement or trying to make a case that this is facilitated by this improvement in the infrastructure project, right? By being effectively closer to other exporters, now it's easier for me to acquire information that would be valuable for me to access a foreign market.
Okay.
So Lynn, I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, so how do we think of these firms in Guangzhou? It's like they're competitors, so you can get there to go spy on them. Is that?
Competitors, spying. So this is similar to, I guess, the idea of agglomeration forces in general, right? By being in a cluster of other firms, there's this externality, there's knowledge spillover. Firms benefit from each other when they interact, but benefit when they interact with each other. And there's later on, we are going to present a model in which we formalize this idea, but basically the story that we have in mind is firms have their own acquired information, but by engaging in this knowledge exchange, there's a possibility for them to improve their own self-collected insights. So firms would be willing to participate in this in the hope that they will also be able to gather valuable information from other firms through these exchanges.
Right. I don't mean to push it, but I guess when I think about the Silicon Valley story, right, it's usually like we're there and then we go have beers together and then we solve problems, right? I might mention something. But this person is traveling. So I'm kind of thinking about, so he or she has a network in Guangzhou, is that right? And so you have friends that you're gonna, so it's the same kind of story that you're thinking about, like
friends, trading partners, your collaborators, but basically there's a benefit of being closer to all these people that can give you valuable information. And the thing is, the closer you are in effective distance to those people, the better you will be. That's the case that we're trying to argue and identify here.
I see. But I guess I was just thinking in that example, then you could just think of somebody saying, okay, well, if somebody already know or my contact, then I could call them and find out what's going on in the market. They could send me a picture of what the new designs are. You know what I mean? So that's right. Where I'm kind of struggling to fix that.
Yeah. So here we are. Yeah. See, here we are saying that there are always means for you to access this knowledge, right, through modern communication technologies or making these long trips. What we are saying is, if you can, there's a way for you to have more frequent face-to-face interactions that's going to improve the quality of the interaction, right? So because some of the information I exchange may be deliberately, but a lot of this also comes from tacit knowledge exchanges, which comes up when you get to meet each other more often, more frequently.
Okay.
And so we are identifying the marginal effects, the marginal benefits of face-to-face interactions.
Got it. Thanks.
You will acknowledge that a firm can gain competitive advantage by investing in its own infrastructure, such as when Hutchison Whampoa built some of the first large refrigeration plants in China. They gained an advantage in the ice cream market without sharing it with others.
Definitely, yes. Okay. Yeah. Firm's own competitive advantage is always going to be there. Here we're just saying that there's also value in sharing some of the information with other people. All right, so great question, great discussions. Please feel free to ask more.
I have just a very quick one. When you're talking about a reduction in cost coming from acquiring information through the interactions with the neighbors, what kind of cost are you thinking about? I mean, because from the story you are giving us, what I get is they acquire information about what their export potential in some markets, so that reduces some entry sunk cost in those markets. That's the type of channel you're thinking about, like information that they acquire for free instead of paying for a market research in a foreign market? That's the type of thing you want to capture here, or what?
that could be part of the costs. We are also thinking this could be something that is about the destination demand. So, you know, how I can more effectively tailor my product to suit the taste of the consumers for a given export destination. This could also be part of the distribution cost, right? If I want to access a market, I need to find a trustworthy distributor. How do I find those people? And there could also be other kind of information friction about the price distribution. So that's like the traditional kind of information frictions for
But you're not
international
trying
trade.
to identify these different type of channels.
Right now, the answer is no, but maybe you can, let me show you what we have done. Is one of the things that we are wondering whether we can push the data a bit harder, or maybe the model a bit harder, so that we can say something more concrete about the kind of, you know, frictions that we are really trying to overcome through this infrastructure project. Yeah, we don't have a very clear idea about how we can do it, but I'm hoping to hear from you, the audience, whether we can do that. All right, so let me just reiterate the research question for this project. We want to investigate in this project, are there knowledge spillovers in an export market? All right, so what do I mean by knowledge spillovers? This means that we want to investigate how the presence of external export activities affects a firm's own export decisions. And the decisions we are going to look at include where to export, what to export, and also how much to export. So looking at both intensive and also extensive margins of trade. So let me give you a quick preview of the some of the answers to those questions. We are going to start this paper by introducing a partial equilibrium model. The idea of the of having this model is the objectives rather are twofold. The first one is we want to provide some micro foundations for the export-specific knowledge spillovers within this theoretical framework. And at the same time, we also want to have some provide some theoretical guidance for our subsequent empirical investigations. So the model is a relatively simple model and combines two strands of literature. So we're going to embed a model of knowledge diffusion into a standard malus framework. In this model, firms are going to acquire export-specific insights, right? These are the insights that will help firm to overcome informal trade barriers and improve its productivity in the export markets. Now, there are two means for the firms to acquire this export-specific knowledge. The first one is firm can collect their own insights. But in order to improve the quality of these insights, firms will have to make costly investments, right? In order to build up this so-called information capacity, collection capacity. So the second way is that firms can also sort of collect or acquire insights from other firms, right, by engaging in information exchanges with other exporters. This exchange of the idea will be subject to geographic frictions, right? The further away the two firms are located from each other, then this greater will the geographic frictions will exist between the two of them, because the geographic frictions is going to discount the quality of the interactions between firms. So with that model, with that idea in mind, the model generates this very intuitive prediction that if you have a reduction in geographic frictions between firms, that would improve firms' export performance, right? So if I'm effectively closer to you or other firms that produce the same products as me, this is going to allow for more efficient knowledge exchanges between the two of us, and that's going to increase my export activities both intensively and also extensively. The model also generates some interesting heterogeneity results. Right? In the model, firms are going to be differentially affected by this knowledge spillovers among exporting firms. Particularly, more productive firms are going to endogenously be more reliant on these self-collected insights rather than these insights that they gather from other exporters, their neighbors, through their interactions. Conversely, firms that incur greater costs in collecting their own insights will rely more on knowledge spillovers, right? Because it's more costly to build up their own information collection capacity. This generates differences in the marginal benefits that a firm derives from this reduction in geographic frictions. And the model predicts that firms that face lower productivity and also costlier capacity investment are going to respond more from a reduction in geographic friction. And we are going to take this set of model predictions both on this sort of average treatment effects and also the heterogeneity results in the subsequent empirical analysis. So guided by the model, we are going to carry out our empirical investigation. We are going to leverage the expansion of the Chinese high-speed rail network, which lowers geographic friction and create this plausibly exogenous variation in the extent of knowledge spillovers in the export market. In particular, we are going to adopt a triple difference approach in our investigation, right? So the treatment effect is going to be identified of the variations across different sectors within the same city. Right, so our empirical setting allows us to control for time varying shocks at the city level, which helps to greatly alleviate the usual concern that are associated with infrastructure development, right? Whether a city receives this new infrastructure is something that is endogenous and not observable to researchers. So here are the main results that I'm going to show you today. First of all, we are going to show you that this improved accessibility to other firms, other exporters within the same sector, thanks to the expansion of the HSR, is going to improve a firm's export performance along several dimensions. Firms are going to increase their export revenue. They are going to have a greater number of export destinations. They're going to update their export product varieties more frequently. And finally, this is going to lead to an overall expansion of their product menu, more varieties. Additionally, we are also going to see heterogeneity results. We are going to see greater improvements for firms expecting essentially higher marginal benefits of this reduced frictions, just like what the model predicts. So the changes are going to be larger for smaller firms and for firms that produce more complex products located in peripheral rather than centrally located regions, and for firms that export to less open trading environments. Right. I also want to take a pause here to see whether there are more questions on the paper.
Yeah, Ling, sorry, I missed the first 5 minutes, so maybe I'm really just replicating other people's question. But yeah, I've been wondering, you've been thinking about knowledge spillovers coming from the exporter side. Wonder whether you have any empirical facts or from a model perspective, can you separate that from like a buyer's responses? In general, just an example, for instance, we went to one of the cluster producing footwears and asked them, why do you guys all come locate together? They say, okay, it's much easier for the buyer to come to the same town. They don't want to travel, right? They come in and they inspect the facilities of each of the factories. Now that you have this high-speed rail, I would imagine the very natural channels, like the buyer come in, it's much easier for them to go to another town. And then once they have this kind of like access point, they're gonna say, okay, instead of going to the single city, I'm gonna go to more, and to just like look a broader range of the producers. I'm not sure whether you have such a channel in mind or empirically can you see that, but just been wondering, whether you'll be able to separate that apart from like just knowledge from the exporter perspective.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And the answer is yes, to a certain extent. So the model is going to take a stand on this is about knowledge spillovers among exporters. but that's just a way for us to provide some micro foundations and theoretical concept to what do we mean by knowledge spillovers. The empirical part, however, is not going to distinguish between whether this is knowledge spillover among exporters or this is because of other means that also makes being closer to other exporters more beneficial or productive on the export market. So essentially, what we are going to identify using the empirical analysis is just that if firms now they have easier access to other exporting firms, that's going to improve their own export performance. Whether this is coming from the fact that if I have a greater concentration of exporters, there's more knowledge, or is it because if I have a greater concentration, that's going to attract other conducive factors into the local area, which makes out exporting easier? That's something that we can't distinguish based on the current set of analysis. Sort of, I guess that answers part of your question. And a separate but equally important question is, what about the role of HSR in facilitating foreign buyers from traveling to certain cities? So that that's a distinct channel from what we mean by knowledge spillover, because this is not about concentration of export activities. It's just about China become more accessible to foreign buyers in general. Here, we address that question to a certain extent in the sense that we are going to compare across different sectors within the same city. So to the certain extent that the foreign buyer behavior are the same across all different sectors, that's going to be controlled for by the set of fixed effects. But if one can form a story in which that certain sectors may benefit more, or it's easier for the foreign buyers to travel to the more inland area, that's something we need to think more about. How do we address that concern? Thank you, very good question. All right, any other questions before I discuss the related literature? Right, if not, let me just very briefly highlight a few. The paper obviously are related to many strands of literature. All right, so there's a small but quickly expanding literature that examines, how domestic economic geography affects the outcomes of globalization. So this is first two papers by Fajbon, Redding, and Koza and Fajbon. They study how the location within a country affects a firm's domestic shipping costs, and hence by association their access to the foreign markets. Here, the focus of our paper is a little different. Instead of focusing on movement of goods, we focus on movement of people, and by association their ideas. We believe that distinguishing between these two aspects is important because it provides guidance to policymakers when they need to allocate scarce resources. The next two papers are, both of them are quantitative papers that just makes the reduced form assumption that this knowledge spillovers in the export market exists, right? So then they try to make a quantitative assessment of how important quantitatively that is. So I think our paper is highly complementary to this work because it provides the theoretical foundation, also direct empirical evidence on the existence of export-specific agglomerations. This is also important precisely for the second bullet point that I'm going to talk about. There's also a small but relatively active research that try to look exactly at this problem, which is whether there are knowledge spillovers in the export markets. But most of these studies are essentially documenting correlation precisely because of the identification challenge that I mentioned earlier. So as a result, actually, there's no consensus in the literature, right? There has been mixed evidence as to whether there is indeed knowledge spillover effects in the export market. In this paper, we are going to leverage a unique setting to overcome this identification challenge and provide some causal evidence on this. Right, so allow me to skip the rest of the related literature in the interest of time, but during my talk, I'm going to try to relate what we do with what other people have done. Okay, this is the plan for the rest of the talk. I'm going to first introduce this simple theoretical framework, and then I'm going to talk about the empirical strategies, and finally, I'm going to show you some results. Model first. So our model extends a standard multi-sector malus model, right? So think about a firm Z. A firm Z faces a domestic productivity fee of Z. If firm Z wants to access a foreign market, the firms will have to acquire an export specific knowledge to overcome frictions that are specific to exporting. So this kind of information include additional costs or information that are required to find a distributor, additional costs to tailor products, and also information in the export markets. So this export specific knowledge is denoted by this phi of X term. And this is something that is endogenously determined through a stochastic interaction process that I'm going to describe in more detail on the next slide. So with this addition to the standard model, this will be our export revenue equation. We can see that there's this new term, that this export specific productivity term that enters into this revenue function multiplicatively. Okay, so let me talk about knowledge acquisition, knowledge spillover process. This is a two-step process, and the process is similar to the imitate or reject framework in the macro literature. At the beginning of each period, firms are going to receive an idiosyncratic inside job that is denoted by this omega. Well, this is something that is random to the firm, but firm can invest to build up their information collection capacity, lambda tilde, which is going to increase the inside draws on average, right? So this is costly investment. So to improve this lambda tilde by 1 unit, firms will have to pay a sector-specific cost CS. A greater value of this unit cost implies that firms will have to incur a greater cost to collect this information on their own. So as a second step, this firm self-collected insights are going to be fused as a process of random interactions with other exporters. In particular, firms can choose to adopt other exporters' insights, but of course, this is subject to a discount factor because of the presence of geographic frictions between firms. So this F function captures the extent of geographic friction, and this is a decreasing function of the effective distance between the two locations. What do we mean by effective distance? This is a combination of the actual geographic distance as well as the connectivity between the two locations, right? Which is influenced, of course, by the quality of the transportation infrastructure network. And finally, given the vector of draws, firms are going to choose to adopt one insight that's going to maximize its profit. For tractability of the results, we are going to adopt this important
question. Just hold
sure.
on a second. Can you go back to the last slide?
Of course.
So what I don't see is where the externality shows up here. Like, because it looks like I'm just choosing a bunch of draws, but there's like for example, Perla-Tonetti, the way this typically works is I don't internalize the fact that I make the distribution better when I adopt a technology or imitate. And I don't, is that here or?
It's coming up. So let me show you the next slide. And if it's not clear, you can ask the question again. Right, it's clearer if we would adopt this assumption. That's why we adopt this assumption, this Frichet assumption. Again, this is not a quantitative model. We're not trying to estimate this model. This is to provide intuition. So we adopt this Frichet assumption. So we are going to assume that all inside jaws follow a Frichet distribution with a dispersion parameter theta and a scale parameter, or parameter is a misnomer here because this lambda tilde term is actually endogenously determined. What's lambda z? What's lambda tilde? This is their information collection capacity that the firm can choose to build up. We can see more clearly with the Frichet assumption here that a higher value, a higher level of this lambda tilde term is going to increase the expected value of this inside draw for the firm themselves. So with this assumption, because free share distribution is back stable, this export-specific productivity term, remember what this is? This is just the maximum of, maximum of all the inside jaws, right? Also follows a free share distribution with the same dispersion parameter and this composite scale parameter, right? So this new scale parameter is going to be the sum of firms' own chosen capacity investment, as well as other firms' capacity investment, but of course subject to the geographic friction. So this is where the externality or the spillover comes from, right? Firms does not internalize that my investment in my information collection capacity is also going to benefit other firms, in the sense that that increases this composite scale parameter, and that's going to increase the expected value of this export-specific productivity jaw that a firm has. I don't know whether, Mike, this satisfies.
I gotta keep thinking about it. Like, look at the, keep moving. I got the slides open anyway, so.
Okay, great. All right, so let me just highlight also that this lambda S of Z term is the key parameter in our model, right? So what does this measure? This measures a given firm's access to all export-specific insights, right? So this precisely defines the notion of knowledge spillovers in the export market in the context of this model, of course. And also here we can see that all else equal, firms that are located closer to other firms are going to have lower geographic frictions and hence greater this lambda Z term. So they tend to draw higher export-specific productivities on average. Given the free share assumption, we can also write down an explicit expression for the expected profit of exporters. So this is going to, the expected expected profit for exporters are going to be also a function of this lambda Z, and as well as the total cost of the firm's own capacity investment. From here, we can calculate the optimal level of this firm's own capacity investment, this lambda tilde function, by taking the first order condition with respect to this expected profit function, right? Because lambda tilde appears here and lambda tilde also appears in this composite scale parameter here. So from here, we can actually derive two results that will come very useful later on, which is that this optimal lambda tilde is an increasing function of phi. Phi is firm's own productivity, and a decreasing function of C, right? C is the cost of building up a firm's own capacity. Intuitively, what does this mean? This means that firms will invest more to increase their own self-collected insights if they themselves are more productive, right? And this is given by the fact that there's complementarity between firms' own productivity and the export-specific productivity in this profit function. On the other hand, firms are also going to invest more to increase its own inside draws if it's less costly to do so. In other words, what this lemma tells us is firms tend to rely more on knowledge exchanges and information sharing if they have lower fees and higher CS. All right, so the model also generates other comparative statistics that are going to be essential for the subsequent empirical investigation. Relative to the standard malice model, our framework allows us to highlight the role of knowledge spillovers in firms' export decisions. So here, if you have a reduction in the effective distance between firms, for example, through the improvement of transportation infrastructure, that's going to increase the strength of this knowledge spillover. As a result, firms already exporting are going to increase their volume of export, and the share of exporting firms will also increase. Right? In other words, we are going to see firms increasing their export both along the intensive margin and also the extensive margin. Furthermore, firms may not benefit equally from this reduction in geographic frictions. through the lens of our model, this heterogeneity results is generated by this different level of lambda tilde that each firm chooses. Right? What is lambda tilde? That's the average. That's firm's information collection capacity, which also represents the average of firms' own inside draws. Recall earlier what we have derived here. We have shown that firms that are less productive have costlier capacity investment, and so larger CS tend to rely more on information exchanges and less on their insights, less on their own insights. Therefore, these are also the firms that tend to benefit relatively more from this reduction in effective distance between the two firms, right? And this generates the heterogeneity predictions in the model.
Lynn,
all right, so
Lynn, sorry, a couple of questions. One is that the spillover is in the form of productivity, right? So it should affect the firm's domestic sales in proportion to its foreign sales, shouldn't it?
So we are going to assume in this model that this only affects the productivity if the firm wants to access a foreign market. So this is export-specific productivity. If the firm only serves the firm,
right? Go ahead. Sorry.
If the firm only serves the domestic market, then they don't have this means to further improve their productivity.
And then the other question is that, so I can think of other sources of other mechanisms that would disproportionately increase the exports of small firms. Arkolakis JP comes to mind, the market access paper. Why would this mechanism, how would you distinguish between the two, I guess is the question.
Maybe the quick and the quick answer is the major aim is not to distinguish between different channels, but mainly to provide a way to rationalize the results through the theoretical lens. Right here, we are providing a possible story that this is coming from a knowledge spillover angle, but we are not ruling out the presence of other possible stories. We can say a little, and hopefully I'm going to show you that some of the competing or alternative mechanisms can also exist, but even after accounting for those, that's not going to sort of like remove what we are trying to identify here. But we are not sort of trying to run a horse race between different mechanisms. That's not. Yeah,
but I guess the point is a little bit going back to what George said at the beginning, that why isn't this just a decrease in trade costs? And the decrease in trade costs when the entry cost takes the convex shape of Arkolakis would give you exactly what the facts that you described in the beginning, including the heterogeneity. Yeah. So you're making a big deal out of externalities. Yeah. There's policy involved with externalities. It's a lot more, but I don't see a case for it, right?
Right. So one thing we have to admit is both in the model and also in the empirical analysis, we won't be able to distinguish whether this is productivity or costs, right? In the model, productivity is just the inverse of costs. Another way for, of course, an isomorphic model of this is just to say that there are export-specific costs, and being closer to other firms just reduce this cost. That's something that would generate the identical set of results, both theoretically and empirically.
Lynn, could I add to what Cecilia was asking? I thought maybe you could have some defending argument here, which is because the high-speed rail is mostly for passenger trains, right? Yes. It's not for cargo or anything. So yeah, I would guess, if you can separate, if you can show, for instance, if you can have some empirical exercise going to say, okay, let me have a placebo. Let me think about cargo train network versus passenger train network, right? I mean, that kind of can help you on thinking about that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. We have something like that. Hopefully I can show you that. We did show that. When I was saying cost, I'm not thinking about shipping costs. I'm more thinking about sort of like the informal trade costs that are in addition to the traditional shipping costs. Yeah, but absolutely. HSR is only for passengers. It theoretically shouldn't affect goods shipping costs, and a way of showing that. Yeah. All right. So,
sorry, but
are...
can I have another question on your model?
Sure.
I know you are not going to take the quantitatively, but I've been wondering, your model looks a lot like those agglomeration type of models, like in urban, for instance. You know,
Sure.
in a way, you know, you would have strong prediction about the agglomeration of the exporters in certain regions. I think possibly if you don't want, even you don't want to push that to an equivalent model, do not want to think about it in a quantitative sense. But I've been thinking about, can you explore different geographical agglomeration of the exporters to tell us a little bit more about the strengths of the force? If we trust the model completely, it's still your model going to tell us about, you know, the agglomeration level will be different, right? Can you use those heterogeneity to do these quasi-random stuff, you know, so that it can help us?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Right now, we just make the simplifying assumption to say that there's no domestic agglomeration. I think it will be useful and relatively straightforward to extend the model to also include that and build a spatial equilibrium model, so that we can say more about different types of agglomeration forces. Absolutely. Thank you. All right. So let me talk about identification strategy. Right. As I mentioned, you know, the purpose of having the model, or the major purpose, is to provide theoretical intuition to this notion of knowledge spillovers, and also to provide some guidance to the econometric specification. Right. In particular, we want to clarify what are the main determinants for a firm's export revenue. So based on the model, we can write down this equation which is the log of export revenue for firm Z at time t. It's a linear function of this XZST term. So what's that? That's just the log of the lambda variable. So that measures a firm Z's access to export specific knowledge. And in addition, this is also determined by sector time varying effects, and as well as firm productivity, which consists of two terms, which is a fixed component and an idiosyncratic component that varies over time. Beta is, of course, the coefficient of interest here, and the model predicts that this is positive. So I just want to emphasize again that empirically it's challenging to identify the sign of beta, and the difficulty is illustrated quite clearly here. It is hard to control for all location characteristics which affect knowledge spillovers, but also at the same time may potentially be correlated with this export outcomes. Right. So to address this, we are going to estimate the equation by exploiting a quasi experiment, which is this expansion of HSR networks in China. And this is going to help us to obtain a plausibly exogenous shock that affects the geographic frictions and induces a random change in this XZST term for exporting firms. So let me skip the background information on this, and perhaps just show you very quickly about this network, right? So this is a major infrastructure project in China. The earlier lines started around 2008. These are the first official lines. From there has been this rapid expansion. 2013, that's the last year in our study period. But this is still an ongoing project. The last graph shows that how the HSR network is going to look like about 8 years from now. So that's the network data. To analyze the export outcome of different firms, we combine this real network data with the customs data. Our study period is from 2000 until 2013. And in total, we have more than 340 exporting firms. The data comes at the firm year level. So for each firm year, we observe export value, quantity by destination product, and we also have detailed characteristics of an export firm, right? So now we have the data, we have the estimating equation. what is missing? What is missing is how do we measure this XCST term? What is that? That's the access to export specific insights. That's the main regressor that we need to define. So we are going to adopt this measure. So there are quite a lot of things going on. Let me explain each component. First of all, we are going to proxy this lambda z tilde term. That's the information capacity, information collection capacity that each firm has using the export revenue for different firms. We also made a few modifications. The first one is we excluded the firm's own export revenue, right, to avoid this mechanical correlation between the outcome variable and XCST. Two, under our hypothesis of knowledge spillovers, firms are going to affect each other through their export revenue, right? This is to say that one firm's export revenue, that's the outcome variable of interest, is going to affect other firms' export revenue through the knowledge spillovers, which enters into this XCST term, right? So that now we have a reverse causality problem. We have a simple solution, which is in constructing this measure, we are going to use the initial export revenue in 2007, which is the last year before the rollout of HSR, to construct this variable. And finally, we observe locations up to the prefecture level. So instead of using firm-to-firm distance, we use city-to-city distance here. The measure now, as you can see, sort of resembles the market access measure in the international trade literature, which is not very surprising, right? So here, instead of accessing markets, this is about accessing foreign accessing exporters or access exporters' knowledge. Finally, the last thing we need to do is to specify a parametric functional form for this geographic friction function. So we want our measure to capture the following idea. Think about a firm in city C and sector S. After the HSR connects city C and C prime, the accessibility of this firm would increase if there are other exporters from the same sector in city C prime. So to capture this notion, we adopt two alternative measures. The first measure just interacts the export revenue with the dummy that takes a value of 1 if there's direct HSR connection between the two cities. The second measures follow a similar idea, except now it takes into account the fact that the commuting time reduction may vary across city pairs. So we still sum up the export revenue, but this is scaled by the travel time by train, right? So if the two cities are connected by the HSR, we can see that this term is going to be much larger. So given that the independent variable that the treatment effect variable that we have constructed is at the city, sector, and year level, we can add to the estimating equation a city year fixed effect that's going to control for location specific shocks. As mentioned earlier, this is going to help us to alleviate the concerns that the introduction of the HSR may be something that is endogenous to the local characteristics and the forecast for the growth potential of a particular area. So let me just do a quick summary of the identification strategy here. Essentially, we are going to adopt a triple difference approach. In the analysis, we are going to compare export performance for firms before and after the HSR connection. So this time difference, that's the first difference. Next, we are going to compare growth in sectors experiencing more versus less increase in the access to other exporters and their insights. And finally, we are going to compare the differential effects in locations with and without a new HSR station. This triple difference approach allows us to control for both sector-specific time trends and also city-specific time trends.
When you construct these sectoral heterogeneity, you can also do it using IO tables to see if sectors are exposed to sectors downstream from them and upstream from them. Yes, you've done that.
Yeah, that's coming up.
Did you find anything? Oh, it's coming up. Okay.
Yes. Right. So, of course, for us to use this triple difference identification strategy, we need to have cross-sector differences. Right. So different sectors cannot be equally distributed across different regions. right? So if otherwise, a given connection is not going to generate sector level differences. So this plots the spatial distribution for the major export sectors in China. We can see that there's actually quite a lot of variation. So that gives us some reassurance on that aspect. So with this, let me finally show you some results. These are the baseline analysis that's the triple difference regression results. Column 1 and 2 here shows the effect of increasing access to exporters on export revenue. So we normalize this access measure using the standard deviation. So how do we interpret this is that the coefficient tells us that a 1 standard deviation increase in access to the export activities leads to a 3 to 4% increase in export revenue. Columns 3 and 4 here shows the number of export destinations that a firm has. We can see that a 1 standard deviation increase in the access to exporters is going to increase the number of exporting destinations on average by 0.1 to 0.2. Right, this is the number, so we're just counting the export destinations here. And next, we also decompose the export revenue into quantity and price. We see that the increase in revenue is driven entirely by increasing quantity, and this is consistent with the model in the sense that this improved accessibility increases export-specific productivity, which granted is somewhat speak to a reduction in costs, but either way, this is going to lead to a reduction in export price of products. We also look at other dimensions of the extensive margin. In particular, we see that firms, they update their product varieties more frequently by dropping and adding more products at the HS8 level. And overall, there's expansion of the number of products or the variety that an exporter engages in following this improving access to other exporters. Right, so I'm sorry, going a little quick here because I want to show you all the results. Next, what we did is we want to explore the heterogeneity results, right? Recall that the model predicts that firms are differentially affected by this reduction in geographic friction. In particular, less productive firms and firm types that incur greater costs in acquiring own information would rely more on information exchanges. And these are also the firms that will benefit relatively more from the HSR expansion. So we take the baseline equation and we interact this with firm types to explore these heterogeneity results. So we investigate these heterogeneity results along the dimension of firm size. This is something that is clearly predicted by the model. The second one is less clearly defined, right? So we explore all these firm characteristics that we believe or expect to be potentially correlated with the cost of acquiring their own export-related information. So we're going to look at complexity, location, destination, processing trade versus ordinary trade, as well as firm ownership. Right, this is an important thing to do in our mind because it helps to uncover fundamental firm characteristics, and this is going to help us to understand firm export behaviors better and guide export promoting policies and initiatives. So let me show you a summary of the results without going into the details. We find that the heterogeneous effects across different firm types, in particular consistent with the model prediction. Smaller firms are going to respond relatively more. Firms producing non-homogeneous products are going to respond relatively more, as well as firms located in peripheral cities relative to those that are located in more centrally located cities are going to respond relatively more. Firms exporting to less open destinations respond relatively more. So all three of them pointing to the directions that for the firm types that face sort of higher information frictions or higher costs of collecting one's own information are going to benefit relatively more from this reduction in geographic frictions that helps this knowledge exchange between firms. And finally, firms in processing trade respond less, sorry, that's a typo, relative to those in ordinary export. And finally, we find no significant difference with regard to firm ownership, which is not very surprising to us. Actually, ex ante is hard for us to think about which direction is going to be, because even though SOEs tend to be more efficient, but private firms in China tend to be less experienced exporters because direct export is not allowed in China until 2004. All right, so we also conducted a series of robustness checks. In the interest of time, let me just skip those and talk about this. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. And
Lynn, these guys were asking a lot of questions today, so take 5 minutes and show us what you want to show us. These guys are a little out of control today. I'm going to get him and get him back.
Thank you for the enthusiasm. Thank you for asking all the wonderful questions. Those are really helpful. 5 minutes would allow me sufficient time to go through the last bit, which I think are pretty important. So here we tell a story. That the expansion of the HSR benefit firms by through this channel of improved knowledge spillovers. But there could be other competing stories because HSR not only connects exporting firms within the same sector, but also connects other firms. So here we want to consider 3 possible competing stories, and we want to address them. The first one is related to Cecilia's question earlier about why don't we use IO table. So we did that. We didn't consider downstream, but we can do that also. Right, this is, of course, there's this famous paper by Bernard and Moxness that uses the Japanese data to say that if you have the new infrastructure, that's going to benefit firms, not just exporting firms, but firms in general, because it allows for better access to the upstream suppliers. Right, which, if it's easier for firms to find a better supplier, that can reduce production costs and so on. So here we construct a variable that measures the changes in accessibility to suppliers because of the HSR connection. So we can see that this is somewhat similar to the XCST measure, that's the knowledge spillover measure, except now instead of considering instead of consider only firms in the sector in which the firm produces in, we are going to consider all sectors. But we're going to weight this aggregate export revenue by the input shares, right? The higher the input share, the more important is this particular sector to a given sector under consideration in terms of how important it is as upstream suppliers. So therefore, the HSR connection would also benefit this sector relatively more through this particular channel. So that's the first story. The second competing story is something that Daniel mentioned, which is that the concern, I guess it's also related to George's question, whether there's any change to domestic shipping costs. Even though HSR connection primarily affects a passenger commuting time, the concern remains whether there's any spillover effects, whether the HSR would affect goods shipping costs indirectly. To measure this channel, we are going to control for domestic shipping costs by changes to domestic shipping costs because of HSR by controlling for changes in access from the city in which the firm located in to the city in which the port is located in. Now, because for each exporter, we know we have information on which port this exporter uses, right? So this allows us to control for possible exchanges in domestic goods shipping costs, right, from the city of origin to the international gateway in which it leaves the country and go on to the international market. And lastly, I guess this is related, somewhat related to Cecilia's question at the start of the talk, is that we talk about export-specific knowledge spillovers, but we also know that exporting firms are also more productive firms, right? So is this export-specific knowledge spillover, or just plain old knowledge spillover, the agglomeration effects? So to distinguish between these two channels, we define a variable that allows us to measure the access to production activities and to more productive firms. So we first construct this new measure that's the access to production activities that is defined in a very similar fashion as the access to exporter measure, except instead of using export revenue, here we use value added, and this covers both domestic and also exporting firms. And we further divide this measure based on firms' TFP into two separate measures, one for access to the most productive firms in the Chinese market and one for the rest. So what we are going to do is we have these three controls that tells the alternative story that may affect the firm's export performance through all these other channels instead of the channel, or in addition to the channel that we are proposing. So we're going to put all this into the regression equation and compare this with the baseline results that we have obtained earlier. So here are the results. First, we're going to look at the export revenue. We can see that even after controlling for all these three alternative stories, the results remain qualitatively consistent and also quantitatively very similar to the baseline results. This is on the extensive margin of number of export destinations. Again, the results remain very similar to the baseline measures, which to us, we think that while we won't be able to rule out the existence of other competing stories there, but at least this shows us what we want to identify is something that is there empirically. So let me busted the 5 minutes extension. So let me just quickly conclude here. In this paper, we studied the impact of knowledge spillovers on firms' export decisions. We focus on addressing this key identification challenge in the empirical literature using quasi-experiment in China. Guided by our model, we find strong evidence of knowledge spillovers in the exporting market. We also find interesting heterogeneity results. Certain firm types respond more to this reduction in geographic friction. We think that our results have important policy implications. Right here, we highlight that changes in domestic economic geography arising from this transportation infrastructure investment can promote export through this reduction in informal trade barriers. Right, thank you very much.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Lynn. Now we're going to open up for any further discussion, comments, questions. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
I have a little question regarding the interplay between the Chinese market and the export market. More specifically, in terms of the larger firms, when you talked about those 4 different sectors, 2 of those major sectors, the apparel sector and the electrical equipment sector. Now, looking at those sectors, and during the time of your study, a majority of firms from outside China who wish to manufacture within China and sell in China were required to export, I think around 70% of their production. Well, would this dimension or factor be something to consider in your model?
It is, we fully agree with you that this is an important margin to consider. However, the investigation is limited by our data availability. We only have the export data. We don't have any information on firms' domestic sales.
But to export, if you were a company coming into China to sell to the Chinese market, you are required to export 70% of your production. Now, I would think that would be a factor, the interplay between what you're producing for domestic sales and what you're exporting.
So you're saying that we can exploit this policy to infer something about domestic sales?
Yeah, you can't sell if you can't sell unless you can export, and you're a major manufacturer, especially in those two major sectors of apparel and electrical equipment. I would think that that's an important dimension, if not a variable to consider within your model as you expand it.
Okay. We can definitely think about that and potentially build that into the model. For the empirics, I would like to push back a little to say that this kind of consideration, if they are not correlated with the HSR expansion, it wouldn't matter for the purpose of the empirical exercise in identifying this sort of marginal effects of increasing knowledge spillover on firms' exports. Although I fully agree that this is an important margin for us to think about in the theoretical framework, especially if we want to take the model more seriously and potentially think about doing something quantitative about it.
Thank you, and I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
I have a just one quick thought. I'm not sure if it's feasible, but seems like by pushing forward your large spillover story, you haven't explored fully the destination composition and also the product composition, right? So
yeah,
in a way that this is something that you could further look into to say whether if I were indirectly connected, do I actually mimic the guys that I was supposed to be connected? And I don't know if you have any evidence, but that seems to be a very useful way to push for this kind of large spillover story.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's exactly what we are doing right now. So yeah, we want to, yeah, we feel like even though the empirical evidence is compelling, but to say that there are benefits, but we want to say a little more about exactly what is it that firms are learning. But absolutely, we are looking at those margins, which would allow us to say a little more, and things that are more concrete.
Along these lines, I actually had thought of two very simple feasible exercises. One is to look at the income per capita of the destination, see if it makes a difference that the country's richer.
Yeah.
And then two is that in 2004, you observed the skill intensity of sectors at a much finer product category than what you seem to have done just a Rauch thing of differentiated and homogeneous. You can exploit a whole range of skill intensities of sectors. Just by ranking sectors according to the 2004 skill intensity and seeing if the more skill intensive sectors respond disproportionately.
Okay. Yeah. So now we found out that so we are not using the 2004 data set as much as we have hoped for. We use it to construct, for example, the productive firms and things like that, but we can do more, especially the skill intensity side. Yes, income per capita, that's something we are doing. We want to use income per capita at the country level to also infer something on quality of the goods. When firms are learning, are they imitating on this dimension? So both along the dimension of destination, the kind of products, and also the quality of the products.
I kind of like a certain. I'm sorry. I just wanted to follow up on Daniel's comments, which was very close to what was in my mind as well. But I also was trying to understand to what extent we should see some crowding out of the original exporters in some sense, right? If you're thinking that what's going on is I'm mostly copying these guys who I'm now connected to, do we see that the kind of original exporters are facing more competition and kind of growing slower? So I think it'd be great to sort of really see how similar their export mix becomes with these cities that are connected, and likewise, you really would expect to see some crowding out. So I think it'd be really fabulous to sort of just push on that dimension more, because it really sort of speaks to what it still can't completely discount Daniel's story about it's the buyer, right, who's doing all the work, but it just kind of looking at how similar these guys are and then what's happening would be helpful. So, just a suggestion.
Thank you.
Hi, Lin.
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a comment. I think maybe you can use the fact that there are so many intermediaries in China. So, I think in the custom data, we can observe the city where the product is produced and where the exporter is, right?
Yes.
So maybe that can help you to rule out the production network mechanism.
Could you elaborate a little more on what
So
you have in mind?
let's say the product is produced in city A, right? And the exporter you are observing is in city B. And if city A doesn't really have a high-speed railway, but there is a high-speed railway in city B, I mean, if the result is still significant, that might.
I see. Yeah, so that's a very good comment that can help us to distinguish between whether this is about distribution, selling the products, or this is about production technologies.
Yeah, I think
that's actually very, very good. Thank you.
That cannot rule out all the other mechanisms.
Of course,
At least I think it can rule out the mechanism that Daniel brought up at the very beginning.
Yeah. It will also help us to better differentiate. We try to do something here, but it will help us to tell an even more convincing story in differentiating access to exporters versus access to just more productive firms.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
My co-author Yue is also here, so Yue, feel free to jump in and answer any questions.
Thank you all for all these comments. They are really helpful.
Yeah, hi Lynn. Yeah, so very interesting. So could I see I'm curious, could I see your externalities part again with the lambdas where you added in?
Sure.
I think it's like slide 11.
This one?
This one? This one. Yeah, this one. Yeah. So I guess, so is this the right way to think of this? So suppose this were not export specific, right? So suppose you could just get that. Okay, you get this extra term, the sum term. Then it looks like a kind of generalization in some ways of the way we'd standardly think about externalities, right? Except that the firm would have to be in the same location, and then this F cost is like 0 or it's 1 or whatever it is, right? It goes away. And then once you're in some other location, then it's like infinitely high or prohibitively high, right?
Yep.
But now you're kind of, is that the right way?
Yes, yeah.
I see.
Yeah, so the standard in the standard urban literature, the sort of traditional or standard way of measuring the extent of spillover is people predefine a geographic boundary and assume that there's agglomeration within and 0 outside. There are lots of benefits of going with that approach, right? In particular, it's going to allow us to think about different mechanisms and defining different geographic boundaries, right? For example, if you want to study labor market pooling, which is one of the channels for agglomeration forces, then you define the geographic boundary as a homogeneous labor market versus if you want to study other aspects, and the considerations are different. Here, we choose not to do that. Instead, we adopt sort of like we take the whole nation, right? To say that you can learn from everyone. But of course, if you are located very far away, then the geographic friction are going to be very, very high. To us, this is both an innovation as well as this is a way for us to identify this agglomeration force, right? If we confine everything within the city, then we have to find either some random changes in the size of the city, or we have to find a way to randomly allocate firms across different locations. Neither of this is feasible or easy to find. So here the innovation is we allow people to communicate across cities, and now then we just need to find some exogenous change to the effective distance between the cities. That will, to a certain extent, allow us to have this increase in the degree of knowledge spillovers.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, you are absolutely right.
Yeah,
Thank
cool.
you.
Yeah.